Okay, I'm going to continue with Kuf Tzadik Vav, another Sif Yud, where we left off last Shiur 2 days ago. I discussed the Tliya and the Makkah. We're going to discuss Tliya in a Kesem. Now, just to point out for you something very interesting before I start discussing Sif Yud, that if you're going to look at this Siman which discusses the B'dikas, you're going to see that there doesn't say anywhere that a Rav is supposed to check. Look at the B'dikas. You're not going to find it anywhere. It says mashma that the woman herself checks it. She's supposed to know these things. And only by a blind woman she shows it to her friend. Chaverto, not to the Rav. But let's see if this has changed, the reality changed. It's interesting to point out how things should have been done. Okay, in Sif Yud, the Ramah writes, then the first 3 days, if she finds a kesem, we're not Tayla l'halkel like Sha'ar Ksamim. Why? Because in the first 3 days it has to be completely clean. But afterwards, after the first 3 days, it's the same as a regular kesem. And that's how Noach says the Ramah. And this is obviously talking about a kesem which is more than a gris, he says, but if it's a kesem less than a gris, then we're makel even in the first 3 days. Now, it's a very short line in the Shulchan Aruch. Look in the Piskedinim, Talmud Tzemach Tzedek, about 3 pages. He converted it into 3 pages. He combined some of the halachas that are in Siman Kuf Tzadik. I'm going to go through some of the nekudas that are in Siman Kuf Tzadik, and then go to the Piskedinim and see what we learn out of it. In Siman Kuf Tzadik, in Sa'if Mem Aleph, the Mechaber writes that the woman who has a clean robe, that she lent it to a Goya who's about to have, who's going to become a Niddah, or to a Jewish woman who is a Niddah, and then she received it back. She's tired. Kuf Tzadik talking about the Ksamim when she's tired, but it's when you see how it connects to our case. And then she got it back, and she wore it, and she finds a kesem. We are toile that it came from the other woman. And over there, the Mechaber writes, even if she is during Shiva Naqim. The Ramah right away points out to you, but it doesn't apply in the first 3 days. Why? Because in the first 3 days, we're not toile ksamim and davar acher and other things. The Alter Rebbe points out to you over there in Sifkot and Pei Aleph, that just an interesting point. He says that obviously we're talking about that this woman that you lent it to, this Goyish woman, she came her time that she has to see blood. But if she did not see it, if it didn't come her time, then you can't be toile in that this kesem came from this Goyish woman, that she saw blood, that she saw a period. Rather, you could be toile that she went through a shukshel tabachim or some other place where the blood got splattered, and that's how it got dirty. And she is not trusted to say, I did not go to a shukshel tabachim. Unless you know for a fact that she did not go to a place where she could have gotten blood. Then you can't trust her. But otherwise, Giaz Mano Lirois means also that could be she got it some other way, you could be toile. Yeah, and then the Mechaber writes in Sif Mem Beis, I think, that at the end, that if this woman who is tahir lent her robe to a woman who's counting Shiva Naqim, but she did not go to mikveh yet, and then obviously they find that she gives it back, and the woman who lent it finds a kesem in it, and the woman who borrowed it becomes tamei. And the one who lent it remains tired. And Alter Rebbe over there explains why. A simple thing. If you have a problem, if it's something, you toilet in that person who has less of a connection to the cheskas tahara. Now he explains, she already did a hefsek tahara. So he says, no, she did not, she was not toivel yet. So yes, she's maybe finished her tumah, but she didn't complete her tahara. So therefore, she's in a lower range, closer to become a problem. And if you want to be toivel, you toivel on her. And even if it will be in the 7th day, she has to restart counting the 7 days. Even though midiraisa on the 7th day in the beginning of the day could already toivel. We only toivel later, but still she could already toivel. Still in all, it's a problem. However, Alter Rebbe explains that if 7 days already passed of Shiur Naqiyim, she already did the 7 days. She just didn't go to mikveh yet. There's no mikveh available. She's going to mikveh on the 8th day, on the 9th day, on the 10th day, whatever it is. Then, even though she didn't go to mikveh yet, you cannot be toiler in the woman who borrowed it anymore. Why? Because Sai Dinei, Alter Rebbe explains something interesting. Sai Dinei Nida and Sai Dinei Zova, their tumah is a tumah which is totally in a certain amount of days. When those days are clear, and those days of tumah are already finished, even though she did not complete her tahara, but she already finished all the days that she needs to finish to be able to complete her tahara, the full 7 days. So what are you going to do if you're going to be taliet in the woman that she borrowed it? What are you doing? You're creating for her a new tumah with a new amount of 7 days. That you can't do. If she's still within the 7 days, you're not creating a new tumah. You're just extending it. If she passed the 7 days, she didn't go to mikveh yet, you're creating a new tumah. And my chazis, why is one woman better than the other? Why should you create a tumah on the woman that's borrowing more than on the woman that's lending? You want to create a new tumah. He says, well, in the middle of Shiur Naqiyim, you're not creating a new tumah. In the middle of Shiur Naqiyim, when she finds a kesem, you're not creating a new tumah. It's a very important point to keep in mind about that. Even you're going to go through, you want to know the difference, because we have different levels. We have hefsek tahara. We have first 3 days. We have the whole Shiur Naqiyim. Now we have another level of after Shiur Naqiyim before Tevilah. Obviously, after Tevilah, we also have, when you get to Dinei Tevilah, you're going to see that you have after, it's the time of Tevilah, Shiur Naqiyim are over. After she was toivel, after she went home. After she went home, once she goes into the house, it's already a different for certain dinim and chtzitza. There's different dinim when it comes to it. She has to go back to mikveh or not. But it's important to recognize the different stages, and based on the different stages, that's how, just hefsek tahara, she's going from a definite tumah, she's stopping, and now she's starting tahara. Then the first 3 days of Shiur Naqiyim, we'll soon see where this whole idea of 3 days come from. That's also explained the Achreinim and Bechlal, whether it is relevant to be machmer or not. It's in itself, in today's day and age, in itself it's a machlekes, whether you have to be machmer in the first 3 days or not. And then the rest of the 7 days, and now we know about something after the 7 days. Yeah, that is the 2 points from Kuf Tzadik in the Alter Rebbe. Now, in the Piskei Dinim of the Tzemach Tzedek, like I told you, he took this Sa'if Yud in the Mechaber, which has 3 topics. And if you look in the Piskei Dinim of Talmud Tzemach Tzedek, you will see that this Sa'if Yud converted into Sa'if Tezayin until Sa'if Chaf Hei. Until and including Sa'if Chaf Hei. It's like about four pages from one Sa'if in the Shulchan Aruch. And 5 pages. And he goes through, tells you the important points to know. He says that the first 3 days of Shiur Naqiyim, if she finds a kesem, we're not told to be mekel, right? Why is that? He explains to you the reasons. So that's important to learn over here. Even if not always we paskin like him, at least it gives you a full background. Why is that? Because the first 3 days, you don't know yet if nistam mayon or not. So therefore you have to be careful. Maybe the kesem came from her own body. You're going to say that she has a cheskas tahara because she already did a hefsek tahara. Even during those first 3 days, her cheskas tahara could be messed over. When does that apply? If you find the kesem during the first 3 days. But if you find it after 3 days, and you have a doubt whether it became tamei during those 3 days or not, then if you could be toliet, you could be toliet, because already 3 days have passed. If you can't be toliet, if she did a bdika afterwards, then you couldn't be toliet. We're not choishish to go retroactively. Only when we have it. Now, but obviously, if, just to point out, I'm not reading it from Piskadinim, if she knows she found the kesem in the first 3 days, she saw it in the first 3 days, she just didn't have a chance to bring it to the Rav until after the 3 days were up, then it's a different din. At that point already, according to the base of Ephraim is the only one who's mekel, but everybody else, most other people, are chaylik, and they hold that you have to be machmer. You look at it as the time when she found it, not the time that you're looking at it. Yeah, for obvious, if she brings it, even if she brings it after 3 days, if you would have been metame her during those first 3 days, you would be metame her now also. What the Piskadinim is talking about is when she finds a kesem after the 3 days, very close to when she has a suffix, maybe it came from the first 3 days. Now the Piskadinim continues in Sifchav. She finds a kesem in the first 3 days, and she couldn't be toliet, and now she starts shiur nekiyim again. And then she found the kesem again during the first 3 days of the second time. She's again has to restart the counting. V'chein la'olam. Feeling niskalkol kama pa'amim, he says. But when does it apply? Only if the original tumah from which she is becoming tahor now, the original one was a re'iyah. Because when you start with a re'iyah, then as long as you don't have those, as long as you have still the chashash that maybe her mayan did not close, you have a problem. You have to continue restarting the count. But if the original one was only a kesem, then you don't have to add again and again and again and again. It only applies if this is another point to remember. We're discussing 3 days. It's only if the original one was as a result of a re'iyah. Now,
still the first 3 days for the first shiur nekiyim, we're not going to be tailored anything else.
If it's the first 3 days of shiur, that seems like no. Then we're not. Then we will be tailored as if nothing. We will be tailored. The only time we're machmer in the first 3 days, if we're going to be machmer in the first, we're soon going to see now everybody says b'chal you have to be machmer in the first 3 days. If you're going to be machmer in the first 3 days, is when the original one was a re'iyah, not a kesem. Now, there's a Teiras Sholom. He points out to you that today, everybody knows that today a woman does not do hefsek tahara, does not start counting until 5 days after she sees blood, until the end of the 5th day. It means the first day that she's going to do shiur nekiyim is the 6th day from her re'iyah. So Teiras Sholom points out that if 3 days passed from when she stopped bleeding, she knows that she stopped bleeding. Let's say she did a hefsek tahara, but she did not start counting shiur nekiyim. For whatever reason, we learned a few days ago that that there's no problem if there is a gap between the Hefsek Tahara and the starting of Shiur Nekiyim. Could be she doesn't want to start a Shiur Nekiyim for who knows, for whatever reason. She doesn't have b'dikas, she's going out of town, her husband's out of town, she doesn't want to go to mikveh early, she doesn't have white clothing. Whatever reason she decided she doesn't want to start Hefsek Tahara. Or she has a petza, just again, she has a makkah. And she got to have Hefsek Tahara, and she knows this makkah is going to heal within 2-3 days. So why go into the whole headache of starting to do b'dikas, and every time is a makkah, and then you have to be toilet, and it becomes a shayla, can you be toilet for 3 days or not? She's waiting 3 days. So then, if she did a Hefsek Tahara and she didn't start the Shiur Nekiyim, you don't have to be machmer. As long as it was 3 days since the bleeding stopped, and she did a Hefsek Tahara, yeah, or it could be that a woman did a Hefsek Tahara after 2 days from when the bleeding started, for whatever reason it was. Yeah, but let's say we're talking about that 5 days passed, and then she did a Hefsek Tahara, and then 3 more days passed, and then she starts Shiur Nekiyim. Then if she sees a kesem during the first 3 days of Shiur Nekiyim, it's not a problem, because the 3 days are not counted, are not connected to the Sfira. It's not the V'sofar Allah, it's not that the kesem is totally in the V'sofar Allah. The kesem is totally in a determination that 3 days have passed from when the bleeding stopped and no new bleeding has begun. That's the same logic by a kesem also. Kesem, if she has a kesem and then she waits 5 days, so it's definitely 3 days have passed from when the bleeding stopped. It wasn't really a period. It was a kesem. So it's the same logic applies. The whole time when you're machmer, she did a Hefsek Tahara. She saw a period, she did a Hefsek Tahara. And then 3 days later, that's the first 3 clean days after the period. That's when you have a period end, that's when you have this issue. I'm just going to point out, I don't remember who discusses it, but there is somebody who goes into the whole discussion that the 3 days have to be a full mass last or not, and then we say it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be the full 3 days that you have to count. It means if she stopped seeing, on the morning of the 5th day, and she did a Hefsek Tahara a few hours later, 12 o'clock, does that mean that if she's going to see a kesem 72 hours later and 5 minutes at 12:05 p.m. on the 3rd day, that you're not going to be makel, that you could be makel, you can't be makel. So he says there is a svara to say it goes mass less, then you don't have to be worried. You could start, if it goes earlier, you go earlier. But we don't complicate people to start keeping track of exactly when it was done. And first, if we're going to go with the first 3 days, we go with the first 3 days. Right? In the first 3 days, you have a suffix whether the blood from the makri completely stopped. There is a Aruch HaShulchan, it goes even a step further. The Aruch HaShulchan on Piskei Dinim, and the Aruch HaShulchan in Sa'if Lamed Daled says that Bichlal, Bichlal today we don't have to worry about the first 3 days. Because you already have 3 days have passed from, because she's counting 5 days, the 3 days passed from the beginning of the period. If it stopped, it stopped. You don't have to count those 3 days. And he concludes, Kamdumani achshav aminog etzel balei yiro, that they don't ask when a kesem comes, they don't start asking questions. Day 1, day 2, day 3. When a kesem comes, you don't ask those questions. The chayra, they should have asked. So why is the minig of the balei yiro not to ask? No, he was a rav in Russia, so I guess he knew from the other rabbanim the minig, the tradition, that they don't ask such things. So he says, no, based on what I wrote, we don't, since you already have the 5 days, then you don't have to do an additional 3 days, then you don't have to be machmer. Even the first 3 days you could be toilet kesem in whatever you have. You're going to say, may you have a chashash, she saw a kesem, but this chashash is bichlal across the board. First day, second day, 4th day, 5th day, but in the first 3 days more than afterwards. Maybe she saw a new re'iyah, a very small re'iyah, or a hemshech of the original re'iyah, why are we not asking her such a question? So he says it's not a davar shchiach, and that's why ein shoyalin klal. Says the Rabbanim have this minhag, they don't ask when it comes to akasim, they don't ask which day it is. You see it, you tell it. That's it. That's how he takes it. But I'm going to go back to the Piskedinim. Piskedinim continues, the reason when are you toilet in the first, that you cannot be toilet kasim in the first 3 days is obviously, like the Rama says, only when it's bigger than the gris. Because even though you could be toilet in a shuk shel tabachim, or she went, or some other external thing, these external tliyas you can't do. But if it's less than a gris, then you could be toilet the first 3 days, because you cannot be nizhar from a kina. In a place where it's common, you can't be nizhar from these. The whole mocker for less than a gris is from the kinim, from the lice, or from the other creatures. And therefore, since you cannot be nizar from it, then you could be tailing it. However, when it comes to shukshal tabachim, we say, hey, you're in shiva naqiyim, you have a responsibility to make sure that you remain tahor. If there's a makkah, we already discussed, if there's a makkah, there's a machlekes ramo and shach. If you tail the first 3 days, not tail the first 3 days, makkah that you know for sure is maitzidam. And then he continues, he goes into the whole discussion about lending the robe to somebody else. This is in Sifchav Beis in Piskedinim. He says what we just discussed before from Kuf Tzadik, if she lends a robe to a woman who's a nida. And then, because in Kuf Tzadik we're discussing it in the context of a woman who's tahir. And she lent a robe to a woman who is tameh, or going to become tameh, and then she finds a kesem. Does she now become tameh? Here, he discusses it in the context of during the Shiva Naqiyim. Which category is this woman? Do we also have this, that she's in Shiva Naqiyim, so she's one step or 2 steps away from a woman who's mamash nida? Right? And Bechla, what about a woman who herself saw a kesem, or herself was a nida, she wore something which is a nida when she was a nida, and now she starts shiva naqiyim, she wore the same thing and she finds a kesem. That's the discussion in these ones. So if she lends her robe to a woman who is a nida, and then came the shiva naqiyim, and she finds a kesem in it. So after 3 days, you're toilet, like the Rama says in Kuf Tzadik. But if it's something she herself wore during her own days as a nida, and then she wore it again during Shiva Naqiyim, then he says even the first 3 days you could be toilet in it, because we know for a fact that she was bleeding then. We know for a fact she wore this robe then. So there's no way that could have been that she could have saved herself from getting this robe dirty. Therefore, she could be toilet even in the first 3 days. That's based on the Ramah. Yeshayimrim, not so. You can't be toilet in the first 3 days, and you can't compare it to a makkah shebegufo. And just like the Alter Rebbe writes Kuntres Achrons, this Piskedinim to Tzemach Tzedek also wrote Kuntres Achron. He goes to a whole discussion. What's the reason of the Ramah? Interesting discussion. What's the reason of the Ramah? Why the difference between a makkah and the chaluk and stam seeing a kesem? And he says you could go with the svara, like we said earlier, that it has to do with Yichel Lizar. If she was able to be nizhar, then you could be machmer, and she wasn't nizhar. Something which she could have been nizhar from, like a shuk shel tabachim, you're machmer. in the first 3 days, something she couldn't be nizar from, like her own nida, you're not machmer. He goes back and forth. He goes to the conclusion it's not really the reason of the Ramah. Rather, the Ramah holds that the tliya in your own in a makkah is the strongest tliya, because in makkah we know that it's moitzi dam now. Then you have a tliya and a chaluk that she lent to somebody else, that blood came, but either from her a few days ago or from somebody else, probably bleeding. That's even the lower level. And even the lowest level is when, the lowest level of tliya is when it was in a, when it was an external tliya, like shukshel tabachim. So therefore he says, when it comes to a makkah, definitely could be toila, right in the beginning, right off the bat. When it comes to her own bleeding, that's when he seems to imply, he seems to say you can still be toila in it. It's a lower tliya, but you still could be toila when it's her own blood. If it's somebody else's blood, then you can't be toila during the first 3 days. Yeah, and that's how he ends. Then he concludes that even when it's, and he brings then the machlokes about a makkah. You could be telling makkah, can be telling makkah. He says you should be machmer by a makkah, not to be telling the first 3 days. We already know that the Masadik himself is telling in the makkah, even a bdika, even definitely a kasem. During all the shiva naqiyim is not machmer like it's mashma. The Masadik is not machmer. The Masadik himself is not machmer like that. Now, if a woman knows that she has a kesem, yeah, now we have so a woman who wore, the Peskim continues the next thing, a woman who wore in the beginning of her shiva naqiyim, she wore a robe that had ksamim from the days when she was in Ida. She knows for sure it has ksamim. She checked it, she saw the ksamim. Whether it was from Nida, whether it was because she was in a shlachtais. We don't now, and now she's wearing it the first day, second day, third day of Shiva Naqiyim, whatever it is, even the first 3 days, and she sees ksamim in it, we don't say, oh, maybe a new kesem came and added to the pile of ksamim that were there already. When does that apply? Only if she didn't intentionally, was a pesheya in such a scenario. What is a pesheya? So he explains in his kundusach and sifkot and hey, he also explains what the pesheya is. He says if we're talking about that she checked it, she didn't have the option of washing those ksamim off, and therefore she checked it, and she recognizes with a tviyas ayin that these ksamim are the ksamim, she recognizes those ksamim, she looks at it, she means she knows she can't wash it. This is the only robe that she has. She's supposed to wash it. She can't wash it, there's no water. Whatever it is, you're not talking about when today's day and age when there's water, but even today's day and age in certain countries you still not always have water, even countries where Yidden live. And lavdafki you're able to wash it. So then, if she's not able to, she should check it. And make sure she knows the ksamim with a tviyas sign. And then, if she wears it, she could, and afterwards she finds then we say we're not toilet nu ksamim came about. But if she was a pesheya, she could have washed it, she didn't wash it. She didn't check it. And then she finds new ones, then roi lekoinsa. You give her a knas, because you can't create a new, we don't say there's a chashash. We don't come and create a chashash that maybe a new kesem joined the whole ksamim. But we're kindness her for her, we give her a knas for being a pshia, and she restarts her counting. Now, what is it relevant, this whole tviyas ayin topic, today's day and age when everybody could wash their clothing? Because a lot of times there's going to be certain stains that are going to be washed and they're not going to come out. And this tliya sign is important also for a Rav to be able to tell the difference between a fresh kesem and a washed kesem. A washed kesem looks different than a fresh kesem.
So shouldn't they just buy new clothes?
Obviously, it's better to buy new clothes, but we're talking about a situation when la'achar ma'isa, not l'chatchila. La'achar ma'isa. Chol ha'moyed, she didn't know that the halacha, that these kinds of things you could wash, because certain things that are needed, or the 9 days, she didn't know certain things could be washed. Maybe it's at least wash that part of the clothing with water and with soap, that's that section which is dirty. Whatever it is, she did not know that she's, or she wasn't able to, or whatever it is, and she's not able to buy new clothing for the same reason. So then you have a problem, you have to know how to deal with it. So if you should be able to tell the difference, if you know there's ksamim, if you know there's a kesem, which is a washed kesem, then you could deal with it with a tviya sign. The same tviya sign that applies. If you're able, the woman is able to tell, and there you're not metame from such a kesem. Same applies for a kesem when you have such a tviya sign that you're able to tell that this kesem is not a problem. Second. Yeah, now this is this idea that you have this same thing that we see in the Pesachim, also in the Miltzdaka. There's nobody who's really chaylik. There are some people who are chaylik on it, but this is just important to point out. Now, what happens if a woman finds a kesem on a beget savua during Shiva Naqiyim? Ostakasha, why is she wearing a beget savua? Ostakasha. I'm just saying, the Metzias is it shows up with a kesem during Shiva Naqiyim on a beget savua. So could you be toile in the kesem the first 3 days? Al pi svare, definitely you could. Why? Because what's the reason why by a kesem and a davar tzavua we're not metame her? Has nothing to do with the chashash. We say because you're not able to ascertain the color that's on the beget tzavua, b'meili there's no way to ascertain that it's blood. There's no way to ascertain that it's blood. Then you can't be metame her. So that logic will apply whether it's the first day, the second day, the third day, or any day. That there's no difference in the first 3 days and the other days. And there are opinions that hold that the same thing. There are a lot of opinions that hold that even a davar she'en mekabel tumah will be the same thing. The Miltzdaka, the Sholom, other people also hold that way. But if it's davar she'en mekabel tumah, and definitely davar tzavua, you don't have to make the difference between the first 3 days and the rest of the days. However, if the whole reason why by kesem in the first 3 days you're more machmer because we're choshesh, maybe the bleeding didn't stop, then a pisvare should have been that if it's an davar she'en mekabel tumah, you should be machmer, because ultimately you do see the blood. But the same chachamim who were geyser on the kesem, or the same chachamim who were geyser that were davar she'en mekabel tumah, karka olam, that doesn't apply. So therefore, these are the shittas that say the chachamim were geyser, when they were not geyser, and we're not choishesh for this. But if you do want to follow the svara that you are choishesh, that maybe the bleeding didn't stop, then that logic would apply regardless. Now, now we're going to go back to the last Sa'if in the Piskadinim of the Tzemach Tzedek, where he discusses this idea of the first 3 days, and now to count 5 days. A woman who has a hard time becoming tahir, and he says a woman who has chaburis uptsoyim, and she's worried. She's worried that one of these psoim is going to bleed in the first 3 days, and then it's going to become a whole issue. She has to go to the Rav. So then we say, if he says that if her bleeding stops the first day or two of the Shiva Naqiyim, so then she does a bdika for hefsek keilu hefsek tahara. You don't count it as a hefsek tahara because you still have to count 5 days. You don't count it for the beginning of Shiva Naqiyim. But a hefsek tahara it is. And then on the 5th day she's going to start counting Shiva Naqiyim. And then she already got the 3 days of clean. And then she's not going to, even if she finds a kesem in the first 3 days, we're not going to be machmer on it. But obviously only if that was her intention to do the bdika for that purpose, because that way you know that she did a proper bdika, bedugmas a hefsek tahara. However, that's how he said he brings the same shantis, yesh mekilim, because he concludes with a very important line, me'acha she'ikar dover zeh, brings from the Siddur Tahara, she'ein toilin kesem begimel yomim, lo nimtze betalmud. This idea, this yisod, doesn't exist in the Gemara. Therefore, hamekel bezelei hifsid. Comes to this idea of the first 3 days versus the rest of the days, hamekel bezelei hifsid, that's the Siddur Tahara, because ultimately this whole thing doesn't have a yisod in Gemara. It's chashashas built on chashashas, and yes, you can't discount it, but if there is a point where you need to be mekel, you should know that there's what is her mekel. And that is why I pointed out to you today's shiur, shorter shiur, all the shittas that are relevant to understanding if you could bechlal, be mekel, today that we count 5 days, when it comes to, if the tumah comes as a result of a kesem, if the kesem came from something else, if the kesem came from something colored, all the ideas, you should just know that this idea of 3 days is an idea which, yes, if all the pieces of the puzzle work out, and there's a kesem, and everything, then if the Rav feels it should be machmer then definitely should be machmer. But you should look in every way to be mekel, that I conclude today's shorter share, and we'll be mamshich Mitzvah Hashem next week with more inyonim that are relevant to Siman Kuf Tzadik.